fallen out of fashion. Playing. Sad, but true. Traditions are important. Where are we without our history? Eh?
Yes, my lord.
What is tradition? The etymology comes from the Latin word tradire, which means to transmit or to give something to someone for safekeeping. When it comes to society, it generally means our routines, customs, assumptions, and beliefs, and it is essential in understanding pre-modern society's relationship with memory. And I say pre-modern in the sense that prior to the Industrial Revolution, the perception of time and history was fundamentally different because societal rituals were dependent on uncontrollable factors such as seasons for farming and a hierarchy that utterly lacked social mobility or freedom. In this sort of social environment, folk tales and traditions were internalized. Nowadays, it's been exteriorized from mass literacy and technology. But one thing that still remains culturally is this particular romantic continuity when it comes to stories, specifically traditional high fantasy. Lord of the Rings is the most obvious example of this, the literary father of all fantasy giganticism. And right off the back, I'm showing my cards. I'm not a fantasy person. There's a couple of franchises that I like, but when it comes to Middle-earth and other traditional fantasy cosmologies, I'm unfortunately quite irreverent with it. Predominantly because as a piece of escapist fiction, I don't want to live in a world where everyone just accepts a soldier becoming a king because, let's just face it, his tax policies probably would be really bad. But somehow Game of Thrones bypasses my genre apathy with utter unstoppable obsession. If there's something that Game of Thrones does well, is that it highlights the disparity with romantic nostalgia and sociological authenticity. Obviously, it's not a historical recount of the past, it's not an accurate adaptation of the War of the Roses, but all the things that are commonly absent in traditional fantasy, the nuances of politics, and the worldview of those from the historical periphery is raised here and presented to interrogate the whole genre, specifically in the politics of tradition. The villains of this world isn't a mob of cloned monsters, but an enclosed cycle constructed by routines, customs, assumptions, and beliefs from a monolithic social order. Game of Thrones in a lot of ways is the anti-Lord of the Rings. It's a pre-modern world but with post-modern values, because our heroes aren't the handsome knight and his band of merry honorable paragons, but are the demographics that traditional fantasy would avoid telling in order to maintain its fidelity to its idealistic view of feudalism. By telling the story from the views of the bastard, dwarfs, women, and other demonized by society, we see traditions of the fantasy universe as a genuine form of oppression.
I've been shamed and betrayed, raped and defiled. Do you know what kept me standing through all those years in exile? Faith.
Max Weber classified three forms of legitimate authority: bureaucratic, charismatic, and of course traditional, which holds institutions such as houses, kings, and etc. together. Tradition sanctions the power by providing pre-existing cultural guides. Lord of the Rings is the type of story that would be passed down in Westeros, not just because it's escapist in nature, but because it reaffirms the pre-existing state of the world and secures obedience. We don't question the wisdom and legitimacy of Aragon, or the tale of any other monarchy, we accept it through the lens of comforting fiction, and this is the politics of memory.
You got fat.
Karl Marx once said, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." This sort of attitude to how tradition imprisons our characters is echoed in pretty much every aspect of the writing. Feudalism is a world that is orientated towards the past, and traditions forms a constant worldview of timely repetition. Your place in the hierarchy is ascribed. Authority comes from inheritance or divine appointment. It is easy to understand your role in life, but it lacks any form of individual freedom or mobility.
I was singing for a High Lord at Acorn Hall when he put his hand on my leg and he wanted to see my cock. I pushed him away and he said he'd have my hands cut off for stealing their silver. I'll never see my family again. I'll never be inside a woman again. Just don't tell me about fear.
Feudal Europe in the real world would eventually escape this crap hole of a society through the development of production, and more importantly through capitalism, which circumvented all the old ways people had to organize their lives. Rather than being oppressed by the superstitious social structures and traditions, things would be demystified by the brute clarity of economics. The world of Game of Thrones hasn't quite escaped this because of the dragons, which in this world are not just beasts that want gold for some reason, but ideological weapons that can consolidate social and political power, and as a result, the dying world of thrones and knights is dragged on even longer, leaving everyone more and more disenchanted.
Maybe that was our mistake, believing in kings.
Jon Snow's not a king.
No, he's not.
Mary Wollstonecraft once said, "Slavery to monarchs and ministers, which the world will be long in freeing itself from, and whose deadly grasp stops the progress of the human mind, is not yet abolished." In a lot of ways, Game of Thrones isn't a story of good and evil, it's really about the emancipation of individual identity. Because the thing that changes from the most from the beginning and all the way to the current installment is how different society has reorganized itself. We have a bastard king, queens, and a slowly growing alternate capitalist philosophy of achieving your place with skill rather than just being born there, a merit-based societal hierarchy. This begins to override the old structures. Characters slowly don't see themselves as a fixed point, but moving in an ongoing trajectory. And what changes or ruptures in the memories of the past? The loss of faith in the system, because they are old interactions in a new world. Finding out the king comes from a place of incest. Honor doesn't make you particularly right, or even make you particularly lucky. Heroes are those considered grotesque, and the savages passed on by stories are just people in the end.
I have the blood of the first men. My ancestors lived here, same as yours.
So why are you fighting us?
Modernity marked the death of a lot of old ways, but Game of Thrones shows us that it's not something to mourn about, but to be celebrated. One of the largest philosophical changes is the orientation of looking forward, the idea of living with the need to progress to improve. Just look at how society nowadays in real life has reorientated itself for the young against the old because of just how quick and difficult it is to adjust to this new ongoing progress. And this need to be pragmatic is the thing that drags the world of Game of Thrones out of the gutter that is the past, because the unfamiliar is slowly coming into the world of the constrictive self. And as long as Game of Thrones never devolve into traditional fantasy nonsense, like have all the characters be indestructible while fighting entire armies of monsters, then we're good. Oh no. Oh no.